The 18th dynasty is, I think, so this is my bias, the most fascinating dynasty in Egyptian history. I also am a big fan of the Ptolemaic dynasty. I find the two of them really riveting, really fascinating. The characters are really intense. So it's worth pointing out that in ancient Egyptian civilization, men and women were about as equal as any civilization has ever achieved. I think the only civilization that's come close to that level of equality is Iceland today. Just to give you an idea of what I mean by that, women were scholars, women were pharaohs, women had leadership roles throughout Egyptian society, women were business leaders. Women owned their own sexuality. And what that meant was that before a girl got married, her body was hers to do with, and then after she got married, her body was still hers to do with. Her sexuality didn't get transferred along with her name to her husband. So in other words, if a woman went out of the marriage for sex, that was just tough doo-doo. I mean, maybe you should do a better job of pleasing her so she doesn't feel like she needs to. And it was the man's fault, not the woman's fault. Whereas we don't have that in our society, where men establish ownership by a piece of metal in the form of a ring and then a name change event. And you go, well, it's voluntary in our society, then how come 95% of the women I know do it if it's 95% is clearly not voluntary? You know what I mean? That is not the definition of voluntary. In any case, we have this shockingly egalitarian society. And I want that to be the backdrop because some wild stuff happens in the 18th dynasty that sort of reveals that. So remember in the beginning I told you about Amenhotep the third and his wife T. Well, they're from this dynasty. This is their dynasty. Thutmose II, who is the third or fourth, he's the fourth pharaoh in this dynasty. Thutmose II ends up marrying a second wife, I think, and her name was Hatshepsut. And he dies young enough that his oldest child, the child who should become the next pharaoh, his name is also Thutmose, isn't old enough yet to become pharaoh of Egypt. So Hatshepsut becomes the regent for Thutmose, the Thutmose that'll become Thutmose III. Hatshepsut decides that after Thutmose III has reached the age where he could rule, that she's not cool with that, and she continues to rule as pharaoh. Now, when I say that Egypt got really close to being an egalitarian society along gender lines, we obviously need to caveat this a little bit. They didn't succeed. I don't mean to say they actually created equality. It's just they got really close. And one of the ways that can be represented is through what Hatshepsut does. So the goddess Hathor, she has her portrayed with Hatshepsut's face. So if you ever see a picture of a statue, or go to Egypt and see a statue of Hathor. Hathor is the cow goddess goddess of motherhood. She's frequently portrayed as a cow. She has horns that come up and then the sun disk on top of her head. But she's also portrayed as a human with a human face. So she's kind of right, Egyptians kind of blurred the line with their deities between animal and human. And so that's Hatshepsut's face. That's what she looked like if you see a picture of that, but with cow ears. And having said that, when she portrayed herself, not the goddess Hathor, but herself, she actually put a man's body on. So the statues to Hatshepsut show a man. But her face is slightly stylized enough that you might be a little confused at the gender of the statue, because it's just feminine enough. It could be a woman's face on a man's body. It's really weird and really jarring. But I think she did that because of the style of pharaoh she was. Not necessarily just because probably there was the type of sexism we still deal with today, where we sort of expect our leadership to be male. And the reason I'm saying that it's the style is she decided that she was going to have an empire. Now, her husband, Thutmose II, had actually started making an empire as well. So it wasn't that she was inventing empire, she was simply expanding it. But Egypt began to conquer northern Sudan. They went into Cyrenaica. People sometimes incorrectly say Cyrenaica. It's Cyrenaica, which is today eastern Libya. And then she also began sending armies into Palestine and then into Syria. And so she's expanding in every direction and making Egypt the world's first ever empire, a state that conquered territory outside of its country in order to expand at the expense of the people being conquered. She also sends an expedition to Punt. Some of you have actually heard me talk about the expedition to Punt. And so she's also doing exploration in addition to conquest. She commissions scientific missions. She actually is the person who invents obelisks. She starts sending people to the Sudan to get granite in the shape of an obelisk and starts planting them everywhere in commemoration of her glory. It's a great compromise on pyramid, right? It's tall, it's hard as hell to make, it's super fragile, it's made of granite, but it's not really wide, and so it doesn't take as much labor to pull off. But standing it upright is a feat in and of itself. And they're pulling it off. They're building these obelisks, and then she's killed. And it's kind of mysterious, although I have a feeling I know who did it. It was LBJ. It was Thutmose III. And we're pretty sure that her stepson gets sick of her being pharaoh and just poisons her and takes over. Thutmose III gets to go down in history as being the most successful military leader in human history. There's one other person. He's probably in a tie with them. Well, he's in a tie because we don't have a firm number on how many battles Thutmose III led. We know he was in 17 military campaigns. He led the armies himself. And we know he never lost a single battle. If there's an average of 5 battles per military campaign, that's 85 battles, right? If it was 3, that's 51. We don't really know. We just know he never lost a single battle. By the way, one of the battles Thutmose III fought was the Battle of Armageddon. A bunch of you are waiting for something that happened 3,500 years ago. Spoiler alert, he never lost a battle. Egypt won. So just a heads up, Battle of Armageddon settled 3,500 years ago by Thutmose III. He did it by an end-around movement. Anyway, it's okay. There was a canyon. The Hittites were at one end of the canyon thinking there's no way to go around the backside, and they were ready to go, and so the Egyptians went around the backside and caught the Hittites from the rear, and it was a really bad day for them. And that was the kind of leader that Thutmose III was, right? He was always thinking outside of the box. He'll take Egypt to its apex in terms of power. He'll conquer Cyprus. He sent an expedition to Crete. He ends up in what is today Turkey. So Egypt ends up this big, massive empire that stretches across the eastern Mediterranean. He sets up new trade routes. He builds new buildings. It's an extraordinary time period for Egypt.